Biophysical glucose dynamics, short-term lifestyle effects versus long-term insulin response through viscoplastic energy analysis. Number 1233, VMT Sharp 618, March 18, 2025. By Gerald C. EclaireMD Foundation. Category: Diabetes and Methodology. Key messages. Part 1, Traditional biomedical explanations. The author presents two statements concerning short-term and long-term glucose dynamics, accompanied by explanations based on traditional knowledge of pathophysiology. He then validates these biomedical statements, using viscoelastic and viscoplastic energy models within his math-physical medicine framework. First statement: short-term control of postprandial glucose, PPG, via carb sugar intake and exercise within a few hours. The first statement claims that within 2 to 3 hours, postprandial plasma glucose, PPG, which is the blood sugar level after eating, is controlled by the carbohydrates and sugars, C and S, consumed, and by post-meal walking, steps. Carbohydrates and sugars: when you eat foods containing carbohydrates or sugars, they are broken down into glucose during digestion. This glucose enters the bloodstream, causing a rise in blood sugar levels. The amount consumed, measured in grams, directly influences how much blood sugar increases. This effect is most pronounced in the 2 to 3 hour window after a meal, known as the postprandial period. Exercise activities: moderate intensity exercise, such as walking at a normal pace, enhances glucose uptake by muscles. During exercise, muscles use glucose for energy, which helps lower blood sugar levels. This is particularly effective in the short term, within 2 hours of eating, since both carbohydrate sugar intake and post-meal exercise are well documented factors influencing blood sugar levels in the hours following a meal. This statement is consistent with established biomedical principles, and is therefore valid. Second statement: long-term control of estimated average glucose, EAG, via insulin resistance within a few years. The second statement asserts that over several years, the daily average glucose, represented by estimated average glucose, EAG, or hemoglobin A1C, is controlled by the general health status of pancreatic beta cells' insulin function, including both the quantity and quality of insulin produced. Fasting glucose levels in the early morning offer insight into metabolic health, but are not a definitive standalone biomarker of insulin resistance. A more accurate assessment requires additional indicators, such as fasting insulin and HOMA-IR, which are not routinely included in standard diabetes care. As a result, it is challenging for diabetes patients to self-monitor the health of their insulin function. Therefore, in this article, the author, who is a diabetes patient, has adopted early morning FPG as a proxy to evaluate his insulin health status. Estimated average glucose, EAG, measures the percentage of hemoglobin that is glycated, coated with sugar. The hemoglobin A1C test results reflect average blood sugar levels over the past 2 to 3 months. Over several years, EAG provides insight into long-term glucose control. Role of pancreatic beta cells. Pancreatic beta cells, located in the pancreas, produce insulin, a hormone essential for regulating blood sugar. Insulin allows glucose to enter cells, keeping blood sugar levels stable. Quantity of insulin: this refers to the amount of insulin produced by pancreatic beta cells. When beta cells are healthy, they produce sufficient insulin to meet the body's needs. However, if their function declines due to damage or disease, such as beta cell dysfunction, leading to insulin deficiency or insulin resistance, impairing insulin effectiveness, insulin production may become insufficient. Quality of insulin: insulin quality refers to its effectiveness in facilitating glucose uptake. Even with sufficient production, insulin resistance can impair its action, reducing glucose clearance. Even with adequate insulin production, its effectiveness may be diminished due to insulin resistance. Where cells fail to respond properly to insulin signaling, beta cell health influences insulin quality, indirectly through sustained function over time. Long-term impact: over years, the ability of beta cells to maintain both adequate insulin production, quantity, and effective insulin action, quality, determines average blood sugar levels. In conditions like type 2 diabetes, beta cell dysfunction or loss leads to persistently elevated glucose levels, reflected in higher EAG values, hyperglycemia. The statement correctly identifies the health and function of pancreatic beta cells as a key factor in long-term glucose regulation. Both the amount, quantity, and effectiveness, quality, of insulin are critical, and their decline over time can impair glucose control. Therefore, the second statement is also true. Pathophysiological conclusion: short term, within 2 to 3 hours, PPG is controlled by carbohydrate and sugar intake amount and post-meal exercise activities. Long term, within several years, EAG is governed by the health status of pancreatic beta cells' insulin function, encompassing both quantity and quality. Part 2, Viscoplastic Energy Proof, VMT, of Math Physical Medicine. Having explained how lifestyle factors influence glucose levels in the short term, and how insulin function affects glucose over longer periods, using traditional pathophysiological perspectives, the author will now validate these biomedical findings through a math-physical modeling approach. Specifically, the author will employ both viscoelastic, for ppg over 3 hours, and viscoplastic, for EcG and insulin resistance over 10 years, energy models to simulate and analyze glucose dynamics across different time scales. This analysis is based on the author's personal data collected over a decade, from May 15, 2015 to March 17, 2025. 4 statistical correlations: ppg versus C and S, 69%, ppg versus steps, -31%, EcG versus FPG, 96%, EcG versus ppg, 99%, VMT energy analysis of ppg versus C and S and steps, short term. The short duration VMT energy contribution ratios are calculated based on the interaction between output strain, ppg, and 2 input factors, carbohydrate and sugar, C and S, intake and walking activity, steps. The energy contributions are as follows: C and S intake, 35%, walking steps, 65%. The 65% contribution from walking highlights that burning 14 grams of C and S requires fewer than 4,000 steps, underscoring the significant role of both physical activity and food intake in short-term glucose regulation. VMT energy analysis of EcG versus FPG, long-term. The long duration of VMT energy contribution ratios are calculated based on the interaction between output, strain, EcG, and 2 input factors, FPG and ppg. Particularly the FPG for simulating the insulin resistance effect. These 2 VMT energy contribution ratios are as follows: FPG, 55%, ppg, 45%. The higher 55% contribution from FPG suggests that FPG, a more accessible biomarker for assessing insulin resistance, plays a more significant role in long-term glucose control than ppg, even though the number of ppg data points is far greater than that of FPG. This highlights the greater relative impact of insulin resistance, compared to lifestyle factors in regulating sustained long-term glucose levels. Final remarks: the closed-loop ppg diagram in the VMT energy results indicates that the short-term 3-hour ppg phenomenon exhibits viscoelastic behavior, where the word closed refers to the energy level at the initial time point, being nearly equal to that at the ending time point. This closed-loop ppg diagram follows a viscoelastic behavior, where the final ppg at 180 minutes, 117.0 mg per deciliter, closely matches the initial ppg at 0 minutes, 116.6 mg per deciliter, with a peak at 60 minutes, 126.0 mg per deciliter. This viscoelastic behavior demonstrates that diet and exercise primarily influence ppg over short periods, typically within a few hours. In contrast, the open-loop EcG diagram in the VMT energy results shows that the long-term 10-year relationship between EcG and FPG follows a viscoplastic behavior. Over a decade, his EcG decreased from 129 mg per deciliter in 2015 to 87 mg per deciliter in 2025, while his FPG dropped from 121 mg per deciliter to 80 mg per deciliter in the same period. The word open here refers to the energy level at the initial year of 2015, being different from that at the ending year of 2025. The value of this opening gap is approximately 42 mg per deciliter. Conclusion: the author's carbohydrate and sugar intake control around 13 grams per meal, combined with his persistent post-meal walking exercise of around 4,000 steps, effectively regulated his ppg in the short term, within each 3-hour cycle. However, his long-term diabetes control, EcG or hemoglobin A1c, was primarily influenced by his sustained efforts to lower his FPG in early morning over the past 10 years.